The iron shackles had worn grooves into Mara's wrists, pale scars that told the story of 3 winters in the Duke's dungeon. She sat on the straw-covered stones, her once golden hair now dulled to the color of old wheat, listening to the familiar sound of boots on the stairs above. Another curious lord, perhaps, come to see the peasant woman who dared refuse a duke's marriage proposal. She no longer lifted her head when they came. The heavy wooden door creaked open and torchlight spilled across the damp stones. But these footsteps were different, measured, purposeful, carrying the weight of authority rather than idle curiosity. "By my sword," a deep voice said quietly, "what manner of justice is this?" Sir Garrett of Blackmoor had seen many dungeons in his 28 years, but none that housed a woman for the crime of choosing her own fate. He descended the narrow stone steps, his mail clinking softly in the confined space, following the Duke's steward who had been regaling him with tales of the stubborn peasant wench below. "She could have been a duchess," the steward was saying, his keys jangling as they reached the bottom. "Duke Aldric offered her position, wealth, a place at court. But she refused him, my lord, refused, said she'd rather die in chains than warm his bed." The steward thrust his torch toward the cell, and Garrett's breath caught. The woman sitting against the far wall was not the broken creature he had expected. Despite the grime and the thin shift that hung from her frame, despite the hollow cheeks and the iron around her wrists, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of unbroken will. When she finally looked up at him, her green eyes held no plea, no desperate hope, only a quiet assessment, as if she were measuring his worth rather than begging for his mercy. 3 years, Garrett said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 3 years for refusing a marriage proposal. "The Duke's proposal," the steward corrected, as if that made all the difference. "She's caused quite a stir, my lord. Other peasant women have grown ideas. His Grace thought an example necessary." Mara's laugh was soft and bitter. "An example," she repeated, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes, I suppose that's what I am." Garrett stepped closer to the cell, ignoring the steward's nervous shuffle. "What is your name?" "Mara of Thornfield, Sir Knight, though I doubt there's much of Thornfield left in me now." The steward tugged at Garrett's sleeve. "My lord, the Duke expects you in the great hall, the feast." "Leave us." Garrett's command was quiet, but absolute. The steward's protests died in his throat as he met the knight's steel-gray gaze. "Go. Now." When they were alone, Garrett knelt beside the cell bars, bringing himself to her eye level. The gesture surprised Mara. Lords did not kneel for peasants, even imprisoned ones. "Tell me why," he said simply. Mara studied his face in the torchlight. Square jaw darkened with travel beard, eyes that held genuine interest rather than cruel curiosity, hands that rested easy on his knees without reaching for her through the bars like others had. A knight, clearly, but young enough to still believe in the chivalric ideals that older lords had forgotten. "Because I am not a prize to be won or a broodmare to be claimed," she said finally. "Because my father sold me like a sack of grain and Duke Aldric bought me like property. Because when I said no, they decided my voice didn't matter. And now?" She held up her shackled hands. "Now I am an example of what happens to peasant women who think they have choices." Garrett's jaw tightened. He had sworn oaths of chivalry, had vowed to protect the innocent and defend justice. But justice, he was learning, meant different things to different lords. Duke Aldric's justice was the kind that chained a woman for refusing to spread her legs on command. "Your father?" "Dead these 2 years past," Mara said, "drank himself into the grave with the Duke's silver." Her voice held no grief, only fact. "Not that it matters. The contract remains." Garrett rose slowly, his mind racing.
He had come to negotiate grain supplies with Duke Aldric, representing his Lord Father's holdings in the north. But this was not about grain or politics or alliances. This was about the oath he had sworn before God and his peers, the oath that required him to protect those who could not protect themselves. "The keys," he said, extending his hand toward the torch bracket where the steward had hung them. Mara's eyes widened. "Sir Knight, you cannot—" "I can." He retrieved the keys, their iron cold against his palm. "And I will." "You'll be called thief, kidnapper, oath-breaker," Mara said, but she was already rising, hope kindling in her chest like a long-banked fire. "Duke Aldric has the king's ear. He'll brand you outlaw." Garrett selected the largest key and fitted it to her shackles. "Then I'll be an outlaw who can sleep with his honor intact." The iron fell away from her wrists with a soft clank. "Can you ride?" Mara rubbed her wrists, feeling blood flow return to her hands. "I grew up in Thornfield, Sir Knight. I could ride before I could walk properly." She paused, meeting his eyes. "But why? You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Garrett offered him his cloak, the heavy wool lined with fur. "Because no woman should be chained for choosing her own fate. Because I swore an oath to protect the innocent, not to enable the powerful." He helped her wrap the cloak around her shoulders, careful not to touch her freed wrists. "Because someone needs to say, 'No more.'" Above them, the sounds of the feast continued. Laughter, music, the clink of goblets. Duke Aldric would be holding court, regaling his guests with tales of his own magnificence, never imagining that his prized possession was being freed by a knight who still believed in the ideals of chivalry. "My horse is in the stables," Garrett said, moving toward the stairs. "We'll need to move quickly and quietly." Mara followed him, her bare feet silent on the cold stones. "Where will we go?" "North," he said without hesitation. "To my father's lands. Duke Aldric's authority ends at the River Moor. Unless you have somewhere else. Family, perhaps?" "No family left," Mara said simply. "And Thornfield?" She shook her head. "There's nothing left for me there." They climbed the stairs together, each step taking Mara further from 3 years of captivity and closer to an uncertain freedom. At the top, Garrett cracked the door and peered into the corridor, empty save for the distant sounds of revelry from the great hall. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward the servants' passage that would take them to the stables without crossing the main courtyard. As they moved through the shadowed corridors of Duke Aldric's castle, Mara found herself studying the knight who had appeared like an answer to prayers she had stopped praying. He moved with the confidence of a man trained for battle, but his consideration for her weakened state, his careful attention to her comfort, spoke of gentility beneath the warrior's exterior. The stable was dark and quiet, filled with the warm scents of hay and horses. Garrett's destrier, a powerful black stallion, nickered softly at his approach. As Garrett saddled the horse with practiced efficiency, Mara stood in the doorway, watching for guards and marveling at the turn her life had taken. 3 hours ago, she had been resigned to dying in chains, her spirit worn thin by years of captivity. Now she was preparing to flee into the night with a knight who risked everything to free a woman he barely knew. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Ready?" Garrett asked, leading the horse toward her. Mara nodded, accepting his help to mount behind him. The destrier was tall and broad, built for carrying an armored knight into battle, and she had to grip Garrett's belt to keep her seat as they rode quietly out of the stable and toward the castle gates. The guards were drinking in the gatehouse, their attention focused on dice and ale rather than their duties. Garrett's confident bearing and noble appearance carried them through without question, Just a knight departing early from the feast, nothing more. Only when the castle walls were behind them and they were riding hard along the moonlit road did Mara allow herself to believe it. She was free. The iron was gone from her wrists, the stone walls no longer pressed close around her, and the night air carried the promise of a future she could choose for herself. "Thank you," she whispered against Garrett's back, knowing he might not hear her over the thunder of hoofbeats. But he did hear, and his hand briefly covered hers where it rested at his waist, a knight's promise, sealed in darkness and hope, that her chains would never bind her again.
They rode through the night without stopping, putting distance between themselves and Duke Aldric's certain fury. The destriers' powerful stride ate up the miles, carrying them north along roads that grew rougher and less traveled as they left the Duke's prosperous lands behind. As dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Garrett finally allowed them to rest beside a small stream bordered by oak trees. Mara slid from the horse's back, her legs unsteady after the long ride, and Garrett was there immediately to steady her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Forgive me," he said, noting her difficulty. "I should have stopped sooner, but Duke Aldric's men could be following," Mara finished, easing herself down onto the grass beside the stream. "I understand." She cupped water in her palms and drank deeply, the cold liquid clearing the last fog of captivity from her mind. "How much further to the river?" "Half a day's ride if we push hard." Garrett unsaddled his destrier and led the horse to drink. "But you need rest and food." He produced bread and dried meat from his saddlebags, along with a skin of weak ale. "It's not much, but—" "It's more than I've had in months," Mara said softly, accepting the food gratefully. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Garrett kept watch on the road behind them. The Duke's hospitality ran more towards stale bread and thin gruel. Garrett's jaw tightened at the reminder of her treatment, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Tell me about Thornfield. What was it like before your father made his bargain?" Mara's eyes grew distant, remembering. "A good place. Small, but the soil was rich and the people kind. My mother died when I was young, but the village women helped raise me. Old Marta taught me healing herbs. Father Willem showed me letters and numbers." She smiled faintly. "I was useful there. I helped deliver babies, tended the sick, kept the harvest records." "You can read and write?" Garrett's surprise was evident. "Father Willem said God gave women minds same as men, and it was a sin to waste them." Mara's expression darkened. "My father thought differently, especially after he discovered how much Duke Aldric was willing to pay for a virgin who could sign her own marriage contract." The bitterness in her voice made Garrett wince. He had grown up with honor and privilege, his father's love and protection constant as sunrise. The idea of a father selling his daughter like livestock was foreign to his understanding of the world. "What happened to Thornfield after you were taken?" "Aldric's men came for taxes, then came again for more. Without the healing woman and the record keeper?" She shrugged. "People scattered. Some to the cities, some to other lords' lands. The strong survived, the weak didn't." She met his eyes. "That's what happens when powerful men decide they want something, Garrett. The little people pay the price." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the stream and the morning songs of birds. Garrett found himself studying Mara's profile as she gazed across the water. Even worn thin by captivity, even dressed in his oversized cloak and a prisoner's shift, she carried herself with quiet dignity. There was strength in the set of her shoulders, intelligence in her green eyes, and something else, a resilience that 3 years of chains hadn't broken. "You could have given in," he said quietly, "married the Duke, lived in comfort." Mara turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised. "Could you have? If some
powerful woman had bought you like a prize bull, demanded you service her whether you willed it or not, could you have simply accepted it for the sake of comfort? The question struck him like a physical blow. Garrett had never thought of it in those terms, had never imagined his own body as currency to be traded, his own choices stripped away by someone else's desire and gold. The very idea filled him with revulsion. "No, I could not," he said finally. "Then you understand." Mara rose and walked to the stream's edge, kneeling to splash cold water on her face and neck. She washed away the last traces of the dungeon, noting the care she took with her freed wrists, the way she moved as if testing her body's responses after years of confinement. When she pushed back her damp hair, he caught sight of a thin scar along her temple, old but distinct. "How did you get that?" he asked, pointing to the mark. Mara's hand went instinctively to the scar. "The first time I refused Duke Aldric's advances, he decided I needed encouragement to see reason." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Garrett saw the old pain flicker in her eyes. After that, he contented himself with threats and starvation, said he wanted me whole for the wedding, even if I had to be carried to the altar. The casual mention of violence made something dark and furious rise in Garrett's chest. He had seen battle, had killed men in honorable combat, but the thought of Aldric striking a defenseless woman filled him with a rage that had nothing to do with chivalric ideals and everything to do with basic human decency. "He will not touch you again," Garrett said, his voice deadly quiet. "On my oath, Mara, he will never touch you again." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. The young knight who had freed her with idealistic purpose was still there, but underneath she glimpsed something harder, a man capable of violence when those under his protection were threatened. "You hardly know me," she said, but not unkindly. "Why does my fate matter so much to you?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Why did it matter? Was it simply his chivalric oath, his duty to protect the innocent? Or was it something more personal, the way she had faced 3 years of hell without breaking, the dignity she maintained even in chains, the quick intelligence in her green eyes?
"I know enough," he said finally. "I know you chose suffering over surrender. I know you can read and write and heal, that you helped your people and they loved you for it. I know you've been treated as property instead of a person, and that offends everything I believe about honor and justice." He met her eyes. "And I know that in the few hours since I freed you, you've shown more courage and grace than most nobles display in a lifetime." A flush rose in Mara's cheeks at his words. After years of being told she was worthless, stubborn, a burden and a disappointment, his honest praise felt like sunlight after long darkness. "You speak prettily, Sir Knight," she said, but her voice was gentler than before. "I hope your father's court appreciates poetry." "My father's court appreciates honesty," Garrett replied, rising to check his horse's tack. "And they'll appreciate you, Mara of Thornfield. Of that, I'm certain." As they prepared to resume their journey, Mara found herself watching Garrett with new eyes. He moved with easy competence, checking straps and buckles, speaking soft words to his destrier. His hands were scarred from sword work, but gentle with both horse and human. When he turned to help her mount, she noticed the way his gray eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, the way his hair caught the morning light. Dangerous thoughts for a peasant woman about a knight, she told herself firmly. He had rescued her from honor and duty, nothing more. But as she settled behind him on the destrier's broad back, as her arms went around his waist and she felt the solid warmth of him against her, Mara couldn't quite convince her heart to listen to her head's wisdom. The morning sun climbed higher as they rode north toward the river moor and safety. Behind them, Duke Aldric's rage would be building like a summer storm. Ahead lay Garrett's father's lands and an uncertain future. But for the first time in 3 years, Mara felt something she had almost forgotten: the possibility of happiness. And if that happiness was complicated by her growing awareness of the man who had rescued her, well, she had faced harder challenges than an inconvenient attraction to her rescuer. They reached the river Moor as the sun touched its zenith, the wide water flowing dark and swift between banks lined with willows. On the far shore, the banners of House Blackmoor flew from the watchtowers, a silver wolf on black field, marking the boundary of Garrett's father's domain. But as they approached the ford, Garrett's destrier suddenly shied, ears pricked forward in alarm. Through the trees behind them came the thunder of hoofbeats, riders, and many of them. "Aldric's men," Garrett said grimly, spurring his horse toward the water. "Hold tight." The destrier plunged into the river, water spraying up around them as the powerful animal fought the current. Mara clung to Garrett's waist, her heart hammering as shouts erupted from the southern bank behind them. Crossbow bolts hissed through the air, splashing into the water mere feet away. "There!" Duke Aldric's voice carried across the water, high with rage. "Kill the knight! Bring me back my property!" Garrett's jaw clenched at the word property, but he kept his focus on the crossing. The destrier struggled up the northern bank just as his father's guards appeared on the shore, drawn by the commotion. 20 knights in Blackmoor colors formed a line between the river and the fleeing pair. "Stand down, Sir Marcus," his father's captain called across the water. "You have no authority on these lands, Duke Aldric." The Duke sat his horse on the far bank, his face purple with fury. Even at this distance, Mara could see the hate in his eyes as he stared at her. "That knight is a thief and a kidnapper. The woman belongs to me by legal contract." "The woman belongs to herself," Garrett called back, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "And no contract can bind someone to slavery." "Slavery?" Aldric's laugh was ugly. "I offered her position as my duchess, wealth, power, comfort, everything a peasant could dream of." "Everything but choice," Mara said, stepping forward despite Garrett's protective gesture. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the water like a challenge. "Everything but the right to say no." For a moment, silence stretched between the two banks. Then Duke Aldric spurred his horse forward, stopping at the very edge of the water. "You will regret this defiance which, both of you. I have the king's ear and influence stretches far. There will be no peace for you, no safety. I will see you both branded outlaws." "Then we shall be outlaws together," Garrett said calmly. "Sir Marcus, escort the lady to the castle. I'll follow shortly." But Mara caught his arm as he reached for his sword. "No more blood, Garrett, please. I've seen enough violence in my name." He looked down at her, seeing the plea in her green eyes, and slowly let his hand fall from his weapon. "As you wish, my lady." The Duke's face twisted with rage at the tender exchange. "This is not finished," he screamed. "You hear me, Garrett? This is not finished." But his threats fell on deaf ears as Garrett and Mara walked away from the river, surrounded by the protective ranks of Blackmoor knights. Behind them, Duke Aldric's curses echoed across the water. But ahead lay safety, sanctuary, and the beginning of something neither of them dared to name yet.
Lord Edmund of Blackmoor was not what Mara had expected. Where Duke Aldric was cruel and grasping, Garrett's father was stern but fair, his gray hair and lined face speaking of years spent governing with justice rather than fear. He received them in his solar, a comfortable chamber warmed by a great fireplace and lined with books. "So," he said after Garrett had told the tale, "you've made an enemy of Duke Aldric to rescue a peasant woman." His tone was neutral, giving nothing away.
"Yes, my lord," Garrett said formally, standing straight before his father's chair. "And you," Lord Edmund turned to Mara, "refuse to marry a duke to preserve your right to choose your own fate." "Yes, my lord." Mara kept her voice steady despite her nervousness. This man held her future in his hands as surely as Duke Aldric had. Lord Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "Good. I raised my son to defend the innocent, not bow to tyrants. And you, my dear, have shown courage that would shame most knights." He rose from his chair. "You are both welcome in my house for as long as you wish to stay." The relief was overwhelming. Mara swayed slightly, and Garrett was immediately at her side, steadying her with a gentle hand. "Thank you, my lord. I had not dared hope for such kindness." "Kindness has nothing to do with it. Justice does. My chamberlain will see you to a proper chamber and provide suitable clothing. Rest, recover your strength. We'll speak more when you're ready." As Mara was led away by a kind-faced woman who chattered about baths and clean gowns, Garrett remained with his father. "You care for her," Lord Edmund observed. It wasn't a question. Garrett's hands clenched at his sides. "She is under my protection." "That's not what I asked, son." For a moment Garrett struggled with the truth. Then, quietly, "Yes, I care for her. More than is perhaps wise." "Why unwise? She's intelligent, courageous, beautiful despite her ordeal. She's shown more nobility of spirit than most women born to it." "She's a peasant, father. I'm a knight. The difference in our stations can be overcome if the feeling is mutual and the will exists." Lord Edmund moved to the window, looking out over his lands. "My mother was a blacksmith's daughter when I met her. My father raged, my mother wept, the church disapproved. But I loved her, and she loved me. And 30 years later, I regret nothing." Garrett stared at his father in shock. "Mother was... but she's always been..." "A lady in every way that matters," Lord Edmund finished. "Birth is accident. Character is choice. Your mother chose to be worthy of her position, just as this Mara has chosen courage over comfort, dignity over safety." He turned back to his son. "The question is, what will you choose?" In the days that followed, Mara bloomed like a flower after rain. Proper food, warm clothing, and safety worked their magic, restoring color to her cheeks and strength to her body. But more than that, she found purpose. Lord Edmund's household was large and complex, and Mara's skills with numbers and healing quickly made her indispensable. She organized the keep's accounts with efficiency that impressed the steward, tended injuries and illnesses with knowledge that amazed the castle's aging physician, and taught the servant children their letters with patience that won their adoration. Within a fortnight, she had become as essential to Blackmoor's smooth running as any born lady. And through it all, Garrett watched her with growing wonder and deepening love. They found reasons to be near each other. He would seek her out in the herb garden where she worked with the cook. She would appear in the practice yard with water and salves for bruised knights. Their conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophy, from healing herbs to books of poetry. Each exchange revealed new depths, new reasons for admiration and attraction. But they were careful, always proper, always mindful of watching eyes and wagging tongues. A touch of hands when passing a book, a lingering glance across the great hall during meals, a shared smile at some small jest, these were the extent of their acknowledged connection. Until the night Duke Aldric's assassins came. Mara was in the herb garden, gathering chamomile by moonlight for a feverish child, when the shadow detached itself from the wall. The crossbow was aimed at her heart before she could even cry out. "Duke Aldric sends his regards, witch," the man whispered, finger tightening on the trigger. But Garrett had been watching from his chamber window, unable to sleep for thinking of her. He saw the shadow move, saw the threat, and was running before thought could intervene. He reached the garden as the bolt flew, throwing himself between Mara and death without hesitation. The crossbow bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the herb beds. Mara's scream brought guards running, but the assassin had already melted away into the darkness. "Garrett!" Mara dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against the wound to stem the bleeding. "You don't dare die on me, you foolish knight! Don't you dare!" "Had to," he gasped, his face pale with pain, but his eyes steady on hers. "Couldn't let him. Couldn't let anyone hurt you." "Hush," she said, tears streaming down her face as she worked to stabilize the wound. "Save your strength. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine." Lord Edmund arrived with the castle's physician, but it was Mara who guided the treatment, her healing knowledge proving invaluable. For 3 days, she barely left Garrett's side, tending his fever, changing his dressings, feeding him broth when he was too weak to hold a spoon. On the 4th day, when the fever finally broke and the danger passed, Garrett woke to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. "Garrett," he whispered, and she woke instantly. "You're better," she said, relief flooding her voice. "The fever's gone. The wound is healing clean. You saved my life. You saved mine first." She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Why did you do it, Garrett? You could have been killed." "Because I love you," he said simply, the words coming as easy as breathing. "Because a world without you in it isn't a world I want to live in." Mara's breath caught, and for a moment she could only stare at him. Then, slowly, she smiled, the first truly radiant smile he had ever seen from her.
"I love you too," she whispered. "I have since that first night when you knelt beside my cell and asked me why. I love your honor, your courage, your kindness. I love the way you see people as they are, not as others expect them to be." "Then marry me," Garrett said, struggling to sit up despite her protests. "Not because of duty or arrangement or politics, but because we choose each other, because we want to build a life together. The difference in our stations means nothing to me. You're worth 10 duchesses, Mara of Thornfield. My father agrees. My people adore you, and I—" He cupped her face in his hands. "I am nothing without you." "Yes," she breathed, leaning into his touch. "Yes, I'll marry you, not because you rescued me, but because you loved me enough to let me rescue myself." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, tasting of tears and hope and the promise of a future they would write together. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Duke Aldric will rage," Mara said practically. "Let him," Garrett replied. "He has no power here, and soon he'll have none anywhere. My father has been corresponding with the king about certain irregularities in the Duke's tax collection. It seems Aldric has been keeping more than his proper share. And us? We'll build something new, a marriage based on choice, not obligation, a love that grows stronger with each passing day." He kissed her hand where it rested against his cheek. "We'll show the world that true nobility comes from the heart, not the blood." The wedding took place 6 months later, in the chapel of Blackmoor Castle. Mara wore a gown of blue silk that matched her eyes, with a circlet of silver flowers in her hair. Garrett stood tall and proud in his finest doublet, his shoulder fully healed, his love shining clear for all to see. Lord Edmund performed the ceremony himself, speaking words about choice and love and the courage to build something better than what came before. The great hall rang with celebration afterward, filled with knights and ladies, servants and peasants, all united in joy for a couple who had chosen love over convenience, courage over safety.
Duke Aldric was notably absent, having been stripped of his lands and title for embezzlement and sent into exile. His threats had come to nothing in the face of justice and political reality. As Garrett and Mara danced their first dance as husband and wife, she whispered in his ear, "No more chains, my love." He replied, in turn, "No more chains." She let out a laughter that bubbled up from her throat. "Only choices, only love, only the future we make together." And so, in the torchlight of Blackmoor's great hall, surrounded by friends and family, they danced toward that future, a peasant woman who had refused to be property and a knight who had chosen honor over ease, bound together by love freely given and freely received. Their story would be told for generations, the woman who said no to a duke and the knight who said no more to injustice, who found in each other not just love, but the courage to change the world, one choice at a time. Outside, the wind carried the scent of freedom across the river moor, and the stars shone down on a castle where love had triumphed over power, where choice had conquered force, and where two hearts beat as one, unchained and unafraid.